svegliato. Dai.
Una crostata in Italy is any type of pastry-based tart or pie. The crema is a crema pasticcera, which I'm infusing with lemon and vanilla beans. I'm topping it with fresh fruit, much of it grown on our property here in Tuscany. As in many parts of the world right now, we are in a heat wave in Italy. Every week I am entertaining friends and I find myself needing a cool, fresh, but elegant summer dessert. Something I can prepare in advance so I'm not using the oven right before guests arrive. These are apricots, my love. Albicocche. You want to try one? They're still warm from the sun. You want the whole basket? Oh! This is a recipe I've perfected and I've made it 3 times in the past month. Once as a birthday cake for my mother-in-law, once as a dessert for my friends Brian and Gareth, and this week for some Italian friends. I adjusted my measurements ever so slightly each time, so I have some little tips that later I will share with you if you're not very confident with baking or desserts. I begin with the pastry, which, as always, I want to be buttery, light and delicate, but firm enough that it doesn't crumble and cuts the perfect, clean slice. I make pastry almost every week or so, and my recipe is simply 1.5 cups of flour, a pinch of salt and 3 tablespoons of sugar. Then I work in 100 grams of butter. Until it looks like this. I use the yolks of 2 eggs. And mix them in with a knife. If you find that the dough is very dry, you can add a teaspoon of chilled water. Just put an ice cube in a little cup of water. But don't immediately opt for this help because often the moisture of the butter and the eggs is sufficient to bring it all together without resulting in a sticky, wet dough. I cover this while I get my pan and baking paper prepared. Sometimes if it's very hot, I'll put it in the fridge for 10 minutes. I cut a circle for the bottom of the pan and grease the sides with butter. Even if your tart tin is non-stick, as mine is, make your life less stressful and use paper just to be extra safe because we want to make this tart shell very, very delicate. And so I really like to avoid it sticking at all costs. Irrespective of the climate, it's easiest if you roll your dough on baking paper. If you don't have an amicable relationship with pastry, feel free to put it between 2 sheets for maximum ease. Even if you're working directly with the rolling pin on the pastry, you shouldn't need to flour your rolling pin. The baking paper allows you to pick up the entire sheet of pastry and transfer it over the tart tin. Take your time in pressing it evenly and firmly into the edges. This is not just about aesthetics. We need the sides to be structurally firm so they safely contain all the filling, yet aren't thick and dry. Now I put it in the freezer for about 15 to 20 minutes to firm up. Particularly in the summer, I find this step is crucial. Meanwhile, I can start on la crema pasticcera. In a saucepan, I put 1 liter of milk with the zest of 2 lemons and scrape some vanilla bean seeds and then just let it all infuse on a low heat.
Prendiamo il limone. Senti che profumo. Smell that aroma. Hmm? Oh. Oh. The lemons. Oh. Oh.
Mix 300 grams of white sugar with 8 or 10 egg yolks. I've tried both, and obviously 10 is a little bit richer, but 8 still does the job if you're short on eggs. These measurements I'm using make a very generous serving of crema. I could probably halve it, but I really want to always have an excess of crema. I don't want to go to all this trouble and then find that the tart is kind of dry and just with a little scrape of custard or cream on the bottom. So if I've got extra, I mean, it's always handy to use, and people are always happy to just eat it with fruit on its own. So yes, this is quite a generous serving. I've made this before on my channel. You might recall the mille foglie that I made one summer, or the filling for profiteroles. But since then, I've tested varying amounts of cornstarch. Cornstarch is what gives the cream body and makes it easy to pipe with a piping bag. If the weather is very hot and humid, or I know that I have to be transporting the cake somewhere, as in the case of Guido's mother's birthday, I add 80 grams of cornstarch. This looked beautiful and tasted delicious, but I do prefer it a little softer. When I made it for Brian, I tested using 40 grams to give it a more velvety texture. It piped well, but I ended up putting on a double layer of crema, and it wasn't as neat when I cut the slices because the filling was less firm. Finally, like the Goldilocks of crema pasticcera, I tried 60 grams of cornstarch this week and piped only one layer of cream, and it was absolutely perfect, as I'll show you later on. However, if you're nervous about serving up dessert that slices neatly and sits up proud on a plate, then go for 80 grams. You don't taste the difference at all. This is just influencing the solidity of the custard. Careful that your milk doesn't boil and overflow. Twice I have let this happen, and although we shouldn't cry over spilt milk, losing all that vanilla and lemon infused milk is quite sad. In the time it takes to crack all those eggs and whisk the sugar, the flavors should have combined. So we don't want it to boil, we just want it to sort of heat and infuse. And you can just leave that off the heat now. We want the milk to cool down a little, so sometimes I put it in another bowl so that it becomes warm but not hot. Now we're going to temper the egg mixture. Tempering means gently bringing two liquids to the same temperature. We don't want the eggs to cook, but we want to combine them with our milk. While whisking, gradually add little amounts of the milk. You don't have to do this with all the mixture, just 1, 2, maybe 3, maximum 3 ladles, and the temperature is usually right. Tempering stops the proteins in the eggs from binding together and making the mixture turn into scrambled eggs. And it's just a gentle way to introduce the eggs to the warm milk. Now we pour the whole thing in a pot for it to go back on the heat. Sometimes I like to do this in a frying pan because we're going to be whisking and it gives me a little more room to whisk vigorously. At first, it will be uneventful. You'll be cautiously stirring and watching this hot liquid do absolutely nothing. You can leave it a few minutes to go and put a bowl in the freezer ready for later because we want to transfer it into a cold bowl. All of a sudden, you'll turn around and the custard or cream thickens, and you need to be utterly dedicated to whisking out any lumps for this final important moment. Put in a couple of tablespoons of butter to make the cream super glossy, and pour immediately into that chilled bowl that we put in the freezer just before. Cover with plastic, pressing down so a skin doesn't form on the top of the cream, and then put it in the fridge. I always make the crema the day before for the deepest flavor. Now back to our pastry. We take it out of the freezer, prick the bottom with a fork so that air bubbles don't form when it's cooking in the oven, and then layer over some baking paper and baking beads. What we're doing is called blind baking. I want to cook the pastry halfway with the weight of these beads so it takes its shape without having a filling that would normally do the job of weighing it down. Alternatively, you could use dry rice or lentils or beans. Make sure the sides of the paper cover your tart edges so they don't gain any colour during this first bake. I bake it for about 15 minutes or so until the edges seem cooked but still yellow. Then I whisk an egg and brush it onto the pastry and put it back in the oven to cook for another 10 to 15 minutes. The reason for the egg wash is not just for that lovely yellow hue, but also to create a cooked barrier that seals the pastry so that when I put the wet filling in later, it won't drench the pastry too much and make it soggy.
Che dici? Do you think it's nice? What do you say?
Leave the tart shell to cool completely. Don't attempt to take it out of the tin. Certainly don't add the cream filling until it's completely cooled. You will need to whisk the cream back into life after it's been in the fridge overnight. If you don't own a piping bag, you can cut a little hole in a plastic bag or make a cone with some baking paper and snip off the corner. You could also just spoon it in, but I do love the little elegant swirls of piped cream. For Guido's mother's cake, I wanted to use our homegrown apricots. For the crostata I made this week, I went for berries and pistachios. If you are in 40-degree heat like me, I would recommend returning the tart to the fridge for a few minutes while you wash and prepare the fruit so the cream firms up a little. Then you can adorn these sweet, creamy clouds with fruit so vivid and decadent, it could be an ethereal crostata fit for the gods. Thank you for watching. Thank you to my patrons, and thank you so much if you have subscribed to this channel. All your support is so appreciated, and it really motivates me to keep going in spite of the heat, in spite of the sleep deprivation with looking after a little baby. And I can't wait to prepare another episode for you next week. Alla prossima.